From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. In the spotlight today, in-depth perspectives on the macroeconomic impact of the Russian war on Ukraine and the ensuing effect on the agricultural economy. We'll be joined by K-State's Brian Briggeman, who spoke on this as part of K-State Agricultural Economics' recent webinar series on the economic fallout from the Russia-Ukraine situation. He'll talk about how the conflict has added fuel to the inflationary trend in the U.S. economy and how the Federal Reserve has responded with respect to interest rates. And he'll offer thoughts on what you agricultural producers can do to weather this economic uncertainty. Further ahead, the weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas from K-State's Gus van Der Hoeven, right here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to the midweek edition of Agriculture Today, and thanks for listening in once more. Today, we'll spend time looking at what is going on with the macroeconomy. Now, we have spent considerable time of late looking at the agricultural economy and the repercussions from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Our guest now took the 50,000-foot view, if you will, on the impact on the economy in the broad context, which, of course, relates to agriculture's fortunes. Brian Briggeman is with us. He is the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University. He presented on this topic in this recent series out of the Agricultural Economics Department on the implications of Russia-Ukraine on the economy. Brian, it's a big topic to get one's arms around, so where do you start?
That's a great question, Eric. As you know, the one thing I will say about this webinar that we put together through the Ag Econ department here at K-State is, this is one of the silver linings of the pandemic, right? That you can put together information very quickly and, deliver these Zoom virtual webinars very, very fast. And the webinar went over very well. So that also creates a challenge for us as extension economists to say, okay, we better figure this out very quickly, right? So where do you start? Which is an excellent way to, kind of frame it up. And I think where you start is just, this is a war. The U.S. is not in this war currently, but what does war do to a macroeconomy, and in particular thinking about inflation? And
there's a history behind that. Very close ties between the two, you say.
Yeah, very much so. So I look back over time for U.S. wars, like going all the way back to the War of 1812, Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam War. And one thing is pretty clear. War does tend to spark inflation. Even as much when in World War II it was 14% each year, and then World War I was 22% on average each year. So you have just tremendous inflationary pressures. And a lot of that comes because during a wartime effort, there's federal deficit spending goes up, monetary policy eases. You see the U.S. dollar tends to depreciate in value. And then some things that you and I have talked about, supply chain disruptions occur because, roads and the conflict that's going on. And then also, too, you have energy and food prices tend to go up during that time. So there's a number of reasons why it happens. But when you look back over history, it can be pretty staggering.
We have looked at inflation even prior to the conflict, though, in as far as a pattern that had been developing. And in fact, there had been a leaning in this direction before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right. So this is now if you look at here within the U.S., right? So right now, yes, we're not in this war, but coming off the pandemic, coming off all the supply chain disruptions, some things that were thought to be transitory, those price increases that way, no, we're coming off the pandemic, we're just returning to normal, maybe are not so transitory because this global network that we are engaged in, it's taken a while. And you have to think about the definition of transitory, right? So these inflationary pressures are real. Right. So since January, we've been up over 6%, no matter what inflation measure you look at. And it's looking like it's maybe going to stick around for a while. So much so that, the Fed is definitely talking about, hey, these inflationary pressures may not be as transitory as we once thought. So this is an interesting time where we have an economy that is improving. We see inflation is beginning to pick up. So what do we do? How do we handle this? And if we do enter into the war, what does that mean?
Well, to pick up on all of that in just a second here, but when we are talking about inflationary trends here in the sectors in which it's most evident, you mentioned energy, you mentioned food supplies. Durable goods fall into that bucket as well, you say, right now.
Yeah. So the inflation story, to really kind of peel back the onion about, well, what's driving this inflation, right, above 6%? Well, certainly energy is a big one, right? Now here, when we did the talk at the beginning of the month of March, oil was at near $130 a barrel. Now it's under $100 a barrel. So things have kind of changed since that time. But energy certainly has pushed it up. The other piece, as you brought up, was durable goods. Probably the best way to describe that is to think about cars, right? If you go and purchase a new car, pretty much what the dealer says is, this is what we have. You can order it. I have no idea when it's going to come in. So that inventory there is really limited, which, limited supply will push up prices. Used cars, same thing, right? But that has a direct tie back to what happened during the pandemic. In the pandemic, we shut down, we stopped driving. Rental car agencies, depleted their fleets. They don't need them, right? Because nobody was driving, nobody was traveling. Well, now that we're opening back up and we're beginning to travel a lot more, rental car companies need to restock their, things. So they're buying a lot of cars. Where typically, rental car agencies will roll their stock and sell it off into the used market, and that helps provide supply. But now you have someone who's out there saying, no, we actually need to buy a bunch of cars. So that pushes up used car prices, pushes up new car prices. So that really has kind of helped drive a lot of it. But when we think about food, it's a bit of a different story. So here in the United States, in fact, I was just talking to my wife yesterday about a grocery shopping trip, and you definitely start to see it here in the U.S. In the U.S., we're a very developed, and let's be honest, a very rich nation, right? We spend very small amount of our disposable income on food. Mm-hmm. So these food increases from the majority of U.S. citizens will be able to absorb it. But for the poorest of the U.S. citizens, and then you look across the globe, the poorest nations, they're really going to feel it. This is very difficult for them. And then you think about what's going on in the Ukraine, within Russia, the production that comes out of there in particular, so grains, oil seeds that come out. Right now, a lot of that demand is being able to be met, but what does this mean long term? If Ukrainian farmers cannot get in and plant, well, that's going to really limit the supply. And then what's going to happen? And we see, future prices for new crop wheat, for example, see it's just incredibly high because the expectation of the market is, well, are they going to be able to plant and get that out? So that has, big ramifications. It's maybe not necessarily right now, but you look ahead, it gets to be a pretty dire picture.
And even more so if, in fact, relations are severed with Russia for an extended time, if not semi-permanently. Right. That's another layer to this.
Right, absolutely. So, you think about with Russia, energy, for example, well, they're a huge producer of fertilizer, for us. I go back to the car example. They produce palladium, which is used in producing semiconductors as well as catalytic converters. That's another supply chain disruption if we don't have access to that. And then let alone the agricultural production that Russia provides to the global economy. So this is something that we're going to have to closely monitor going forward and see how it all transpires.
Before we take a break here, Brian, want to get into more economic jargon, and that is exchange rates and the U.S. dollar and what has happened in those respects since the invasion took place.
Yeah, so a lot of the, concern would be kind of go back to like the war discussion of, well, we clearly have a lot of deficit spending. We have a lot of debt that's out there. There's a lot of concern about, well, what is going to happen to the U.S. dollar? Because if the dollar depreciates in value, that causes inflation. Now, for us in ag, where we export a lot of our goods, a weaker dollar is, a little bit better because it's
actually beneficial.
Yeah, it makes us more price competitive in the global marketplace. But in general, we want to see a fairly strong dollar, especially with the amount of debt that we have. And it's holding. We just have not seen the value of the dollar depreciate. We're pretty much back to where we were pre-pandemic levels and holding. Now, you look at, the Russian ruble, for example, it's, really collapsing. There's some real concerns where many Russian citizens are wanting to exchange the ruble for the dollar, even though the exchange rate is not in their favor. They just feel like, no, that's a more stable currency. So that's one example of demand. But across the global marketplace, the U.S. dollar is holding up.
And is there any reason to think that will change?
It's possible. I think if there are potential missteps in how we deal with inflation going forward, how we handle the economy, things that might transpire if we, become a more closed off nation where, we're not engaging in trade, we're not doing those things. Yeah, there could be some significant missteps that could lead to a depreciation in the dollar and higher inflation.
That's the very thing we want to get into as we continue the conversation, the monetary policy response to this and what it means to agriculture. Brian, if you'd stand by, we'll do just that in a moment.
Great.
Brian Briggeman is with us from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University. Again, we're drawing from his presentation in a multi-part K-State Agricultural Economics webinar series a couple of weeks back on the Ukraine and Russian conflict, understanding the macroeconomic effects. We'll return with Brian after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today and more thoughts for you on the war on Ukraine and what that's meant to the macroeconomy and then filtering down, of course, to the agricultural economy, a topic our guest recently addressed in a series on the economic repercussions of the Russia-Ukraine conflict a couple of weeks back. And joining us again from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at K-State, Brian Briggeman, the director of that center. Brian, when we left off prior to the break, we were getting into how the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. has responded to all of this fervor over the conflict in Ukraine and the subsequent impact on the economy. What is going on in that space right now?
Yeah, so last week, the Federal Open Market Committee, so the committee that votes on interest rates, for example, quantitative easing, considers all of the information about the U.S. economy and also what's going on in the globe. What should they be doing towards their dual mandate, right? So controlling the economy for the first piece would be looking at full employment. So the labor side, right, that's one of their dual mandates. And then the other side is stable prices, right? And stable prices in the sense that they're growing at a stable rate, because as we see prices of goods and services go up, well, that's good for the economy. But if it's too fast or not fast enough, that can be detrimental. Mm-hmm. So the question now really kind of, where they have to sit and look at is like, well, where's the U.S. economy at coming off of the pandemic? If you look at labor markets, the labor market is quite strong. Unemployment rates are very low. We see labor participation is beginning to come back up. It's not fully where it could be, but it's starting to come back. GDP growth measures are there. You look at wages and salaries are beginning to rise. So there's a very strong argument that the economy is on much firmer footing than where we were before, which would then lead the Fed to say, okay, the first mandate of full employment, check. Okay, we're good there. Now let's start looking at prices, and where prices, obviously, as we talked about earlier in the last segment, inflation's up and pretty high. So that's when the Fed came in and they did announce that they would raise 25 basis points, an increase, here now, and they do have expectations to raise the federal funds rate to just under 2%. So 6 additional increases by the end of 2022.
And explaining once again, this is to, in effect, cool off, as they say, inflation in a very incremental way.
Right. So what the Fed is trying to do is, if we look back to what Paul Volcker taught us about monetary policy when we had the very high inflation of the 1970s and the early 80s, he taught everyone that the way you could cool inflation is let interest rates rise. So the Fed is trying to increase interest rates to cool down inflation, knowing the economy is on firmer footing. The question is, is 2% enough, right? Part of it for the Fed is it's kind of in an interesting balance because we are coming off of, we still have supply chain disruptions, coming off of the pandemic. We're reopening. There's still a lot of questions out there. But the market really has already kind of priced in that 2% increase towards the end of the year. You can see that as, oil is coming down, stock market is rallying. Initially it went down when Chairman Powell was making this announcement, but has since rebounded, largely because the market was kind of expecting this, knowing where the economy was at and building that interest rate increase already in.
Having said that, do you see, Brian, the Fed having any impetus to be more aggressive about raising interest rates?
Well, I do believe that if the information that comes in and you need to increase interest rates faster, they will do it. Especially when you consider the Ukraine-Russian conflict and what, the war there, how that might affect supply chains and continue to push up these inflationary pressures, they very well might have to increase it more rapidly. I don't think that's their expectation going in, but I wouldn't say there's zero chance. I don't believe that. I do believe that the Fed has turned a bit more towards focus on inflation. But there are other things, with the Fed, to me, that are a bit concerning that really folks don't talk a lot about.
Such as?
Well, if you look at quantitative easing, their balance sheet in particular, today it's over $9 trillion. To put that in perspective, before the financial crisis, it was less than $1 trillion. And that was to help fund, the Federal Reserve's functions and, services that they provide. And it went up during the financial crisis to just over, there was right around like $1.5 trillion. Then it went to $4 trillion. And now we're at $9 trillion. And that is staggering. You look at the money supply implications of that, the debt implications. The Federal Reserve is buying U.S. treasuries, U.S. debt. And anytime a central bank of any nation does that, when a central bank buys its own country's government's debt, it's called monetizing the debt. History has shown that sparks and creates inflation. It just does. And we've been doing that for quite some time. And coming in, the pandemic, it really ratcheted up. And so is this, inflation, why it's not transitory like many were expecting, is that you have this really big increase in purchases of U.S. treasuries by the Fed, monetizing the debt. That's likely helping to push up, these inflationary pressures. But there's another aspect of the quantitative easing, which is a bit puzzling to me, is on purchasing mortgage-backed securities. Back in 2008, during the financial crisis, when we had the home prices collapsed, we had the disaster that was going on in the home market. Values were cratering, bankruptcies. It was very traumatic. One thing that Chairman Bernanke at the time brought up is said the Fed needs to pivot a little bit in their quantitative easing and start purchasing mortgage-backed securities because, as Chairman Bernanke put it at the time in 2008, 2009, was the missing piston in the U.S. economic engine is the housing market. And we need to have a way to provide support to that. And the way the Fed does that is by buying these mortgage-backed securities. So pricing the risk, having that market be more fluid. And there was a period of time when the Fed was pretty much the only buyer of those securities. But that's continued. We've seen that since 2008, and it's, continues to be there and part of it. So much so that even today, the Fed is about 20 to 25% of the total mortgage-backed security market. So the question I have is, why is the Fed continuing to pick one industry that is a clear winner, that benefits from it? When, if you look at the real estate market today, I don't know, Eric, where your listeners live, but here in Manhattan, Kansas, I have many realtor friends, and business is good. Mm-hmm. Homes go on the market. They sell very rapidly. We still have very low interest rate. I mean, it's been that way for some time. So why is our central bank continuing to do that? Is it just because the market is used to it and we're going to continue to prop it up? And then two, what's that long-run ramification? What could it mean to the overall macroeconomy going forward?
In the meantime, tying this all back to agricultural producers who are reliant on borrowed funds regularly, what all this means to them and how they can best position themselves in the midst of all of the moving parts, so to say.
So what I always tell producers, lenders, agribusiness folks, cooperative leaders, it's great. I love talking about the macroeconomy. It's a lot of fun, but it'll make your head hurt. And if you sit there and try to make all these decisions about, hey, this is what we need to do, and I got to do some fancy inflation hedge and whatever. At the end of the day, go back to what I would call, and I've heard industry leaders call blocking and tackling, fundamentals. What made you a successful producer or business leader today? Stick to it. Tried and true methods, right? First and foremost, what's your balance sheet like? How much working capital, liquidity? Have I built that up? How can I continue to build it up? That I can make sure I have manageable debt. That right there, one thing that producers can control right now. The other thing that you can control is on efficiency. Think about your cost efficiency. And I know that's maybe tough to talk to a producer that's looking at fertilizer prices and seed and getting the crop in the ground, thinking about that. Yeah, it's very expensive. But how can I be cost efficient? And then if you're looking at, interest rates are going to be going up, maybe fixed rate financing would be appealing to. If you are going to take out a loan, that might work well for you because of looking at the market and what the Fed is saying. It does look like interest rates are going to be going up. So when those products make sense, that would be something that I would consider as well.
Very well. Noting this, that the presentation that Brian made on the macroeconomy in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is online, along with the rest in that series on the webinar at agmanager.info. The video's there for your viewing, and you can pick up quite a few things from that entire series, including his presentation, agmanager.info. Brian, always a pleasure to have your insight. Thanks for joining us once more.
Thanks, Eric.
Brian Briggeman from the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center at Kansas State. He directs that center out of the Agricultural Economics Department here at the university. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Anneke said, "I don't like to look at those hollow eyes."
That's Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
This is the time of the year to watch your crop come up. On the farm, I'm anxious to see what the brome is doing. It's greening up, but I'm especially interested in the bare patches where the armyworms did their job. When I drove down a week ago and slowly drove the edges of the fields and crossed where I knew damage was done, I could see new growth. I'm hopeful. Moisture is needed and patience. All fields have had fertilizer, and the snow did help. I enjoyed slowly circling the farm, crossing the dry creeks. I felt spring, and the new growing season was upon us. Having the fields along the creeks with trees, it is time to come back with a chainsaw and clean the edges of the fallen branches. I'm thankful that Wayne, my son-in-law, brought his tractor last fall and mowed along all edges of the fields to push back woody growths of invading sumac and dogwood, small cedars and locust trees. I hate those locusts. The bigger locusts have vicious thorns. An offset bush hog would further help to reach under the trees, also cutting back more of the reaching branches. I see lots of work. Many years ago, after an ice storm, I spent weeks cleaning up and cutting back what had bent over under the heavy ice load over and onto the brome fields. When we cut with the pool behind Swather, it was not that much of a problem. It reached under, but the self-propelled Swather, a great machine, is different. It needs clear space. It's built for wide, open fields where nothing is in the way. No steep down and up creek banks, only straight fields. Talking about low-hanging branches, I did get my reward that afternoon. As I slowly drove along the old hedgerow with massive hedge trees, some bending down to the ground, I suddenly saw a white object, partially hidden under a sweeping low branch. I stopped the truck and stepped out among the dirt and the dry weeds and reached through the tips of the branches and pulled up the skull of a buck with both antlers still attached. It was a big head. I felt elated, but mice or squirrels had been chewing on the one antler, and all that remained was a healthy stump. The other side was still complete with some small gnaws here and there. I carefully counted the points. I counted 6 on the remaining antler, which would have made it a 12-pointer, the big one. I placed the heavy skull in the truck and took it home. Back at home, I set it next to the fireplace. When Anneke said, "I don't like to look at those hollow eyes," I put it in the garage. I admit, it did look kind of spooky. I'm going to mount it and hang my head on a gnawed stump. Well, we did get a good rain, and I'm grateful. After a few warm days, I will go back and take another look at the brome and the range we burned last fall. New growths should be coming up.
Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That's our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.